Hello everyone. This lecture video is on factor price equalization theorem. The factor price equalization theorem is actually a corollary since it follows directly from the Hexarolline theorem and it holds only if the Hexarolline theorem holds. It was Paul Samuelson who rigorously proved this factor price equalization theorem. So for this reason, it is sometimes referred to as the Hexarolline-Samuelson theorem. Now, before we move on to the statement of the factor price equalization theorem, we just consider the assumptions on which it rests. So we continue with the two factor, that is labor and capital, two commodity X and Y, and two country A and B framework with the following set of assumptions. There is perfect competition in product and the factor market. Secondly, there is no factor intensity reversal. That is, if the labor capital ratio in industry X is greater than labor capital ratio in industry Y, then it will be true for all the wage rental ratio. Now, this assumption will be crucial for the factor price equalization theorem. So, initially we shall start with no factor intensity reversal, and later on we shall relax this assumption and we shall be trying to find out what happens to the factor price equalization theorem. Thirdly, the production function will be identical for each commodity in the two countries. There will be linearly homogeneous production function so that constant returns to scale will be operating. And then there will be absence of production externalities. Further, we assume that the factors of production are perfectly mobile across the industries, but they are immobile across the different countries. So, if the wage rate in some country is higher, then laborer will not migrate to that country. Similarly, if the return on capital is higher in some countries, then capital will not be moving into that country. So, under these assumptions, and in addition to two other conditions, that free trade leads to number one, commodity price equalization, and number two, incomplete specialization in production in each country, both the relative and absolute factor prices will be completely equalized between the countries. So, along with this assumption, we shall be requiring two more assumptions. That is, trade will be equalizing the commodity prices, and secondly, after the free trade, both the countries will be producing both the commodities. This incomplete specialization is very important. If we do not have this assumption holding, then factor price equalization theorem will not hold. Now, one point must be mentioned here, that here we have assumed that factors are not freely mobile across the nations. Now, what happens if factors are mobile? Then just as I have mentioned, so if the factor prices are higher in one country, then factors will be moving towards that country. So, factor prices will automatically be equalized. But here, it is trade which acts as a proxy for the international mobility of factor. Trade equalizes the commodity prices as well as it equalizes the absolute and relative factor prices. Now, what lies in the heart of the factor price equalization theorem is to show that under all these assumptions and incomplete specialization in production, there exists a one-to-one correspondence between equilibrium commodity price ratio and the factor price ratio under free trade. So, if this one-to-one correspondence holds, then if free trade equalizes commodity prices, then corresponding to that, there will be only one factor price ratio that will be prevailing in both the countries. So, factor price equalization theorem will be holding. Now, we consider a very important relationship between three things: relative factor prices W by R, factor proportions in the two industries, that is L by Kx and L by Ky, and the relative commodity prices, that is Px by Py. And by our assumption, X is relatively more labor intensive. Now, since production functions are identical, this relationship is same in the two countries. So what differs is their factor endowment. So one country will be more relatively labor abundant and the other country will be relatively more capital abundant. We have, as mentioned earlier, the perfect competition assumption in the product market and the factor market. So the prices of the commodities will be equal to the average cost of production. So then Px will be equal to W into ALX plus R into AKX, and Py will be equal to W into ALY plus R into AKY. So we have calculated Px by Py and we have manipulated the numerator and denominator by dividing it by R. This is permissible because R is not equal to 0. So further manipulation, we have taken out AKX by AKY. So the numerator becomes W by R into ALX by AKX plus 1. Now this ALX by AKX is nothing but the labor capital ratio in industry X, because Aij is the amount of ith input necessary to produce 1 unit of jth output. In the denominator, we have W by R into ALY by AKY plus 1. This ALY by AKY once again is the labor capital ratio in industry Y. Now, we assume that Aijs are fixed, but the relationship holds true even if you assume Aijs to be variable. So we find out dpx by py by dw by r. In other words, we try to find out what happens to px by py as the wage rental ratio changes. So you take the derivative and we get the expression like this. Now, the denominator is positive because it's a square term. AKX by AKY is also positive, and this numerator, this term, is positive because of our assumption that X is relatively more labor intensive. So this right hand side is greater than 0. What's the implication of that? There is a positive, strictly increasing relationship between commodity price ratio and the factor price ratio. So as W by R increases, then Px by Py will also increase. So now we consider once again the relationship between the factor proportion and the factor prices. We have already seen in the Hexarolline theorem proof that factor proportions and factor prices are inversely related. Why? Now, as the wage rental ratio rises, then both the commodities will become less labor intensive. Since labor is relatively more expensive, then firms will try to substitute labor by capital. So, ALX by AKX and ALY by AKY will fall in the two industries. But one thing should be noted that X will still remain relatively more labor intensive. So now we consider these three relationships in the diagram. So we start from this origin O, and along the horizontal axis towards right, we measure labor capital ratio, so the factor endowment. And starting from O towards left, we measure Px by Py. On the vertical axis, we measure W by R. So in this quadrant, we depict the positive relationship between W by R and Px by Py. And here we draw the relationship between W by R and L by K in the two industries. So XX prime is the relationship in X industry, and YY prime is the relationship in Y industry. So XX prime for obvious reason should lie above YY prime, because for any wage rental ratio, the labor capital ratio in industry X should be higher. Now given this, we shall now try to find out the range of factor price ratio where both the commodities will be produced. And similarly, given that, we can find out the range of the relative commodity price where both the commodities will be produced. Now here, let us assume that the labor capital ratio for the country is equal to OM. So this is the overall labor capital ratio. So this labor capital ratio will be used, some of this labor capital ratio will be used in the X industry and some of the labor capital will be used by the Y industry. Now if the endowment ratio is OM, then the wage rental ratio must lie in between OS and OR in order to get both the commodities to be produced. So let's see why does it happen. Now, so when the wage rental ratio is exactly equal to OR, then what happens? Then following the blue line, then we find that the Y industry will be using the labor capital ratio OM, and if you extend this, then the labor capital ratio used in industry X will be more than OM. So this is not possible if we want to meet the full employment condition. Then to meet the full employment condition, only Y will be produced. So no X will be produced. So clearly, if wage rental ratio is equal to R, then only Y will be produced. So corresponding to this OR, the commodity price ratio will be P2. So when the commodity price ratio is equal to P2, then only Y will be produced. Now consider the wage rental ratio, which is OS. Now at point OS, if we consider this pink line, then the labor capital ratio used in industry X will be exactly OM. Then here only X will be produced if the full employment condition is met. So no Y will be produced. So corresponding to this S, we get the commodity price ratio, which is P1. So P1 is the price which gives us production of only X and no Y. So therefore, at point S only X is produced, at point R only Y is produced. So if only the factor price ratio lies in the range S and R, then both the commodities will be produced. Similarly, if the commodity price ratio is lying in between P1 and P2, then both the commodities will be produced. Production of one commodity will violate the full employment condition. Now, if the wage rental ratio lies in between S and R, suppose it is given by this red line, then what happens? Then both the commodities will be produced. So if we consider this red line, then Y will be produced here. So the labor capital ratio used in Y will be less than the overall endowment OM, and the labor capital ratio used in industry X is more than the overall endowment OM. So corresponding to this factor price ratio, we can find out the unique commodity price ratio, which is P. Let us now consider the case where the factor price equalization theorem is possible. To start with, we assume that the two countries have the same labor capital ratio, which is equal to OK. So this OK is the labor capital ratio in industry in country A. Similarly, it is the labor capital ratio in country B. So let us now, given this OK, find out the factor price range. So just we draw a line like AK. So it cuts XX prime at point A and cuts YY prime at point B. So from here we get the wage rental ratio limit at OR, and from this point we get the wage rental ratio limit as S. So RS is the range, factor price range for country A. So in the pre-trade situation, the factor price ratio for country A will be lying somewhere in the RS region. So corresponding to this factor price ratio, we can find out the relative commodity price ratios also. So corresponding to S, we get P1, and corresponding to R, we get P2. So therefore, for country A, the range of relative commodity price will be P1, P2. So in the pre-trade situation, the relative commodity price will be lying somewhere here and the relative factor price will lie somewhere here. And similarly for country B. So for country B also, this is the same factor price range prevailing and this is the same commodity price range. Now in this case, factor price equalization is not only possible but it is a necessity. So let's see how. So suppose initially one country has factor price ratio here. So here. So then we can read the commodity price ratio also. So if it is somewhere here, so we can read the commodity price ratio to be somewhere here. For the other country, suppose the commodity price ratio is somewhere here and the factor price ratio is somewhere here. So it's like this. Okay. Now, free trade will equalize the commodity prices. So after this, after free trade, suppose commodity prices are settled here. So that is the free trade commodity price. So corresponding to this, we will always be getting a unique wage rental ratio. So although we started from a case that the factor price ratios and the commodity price ratios are different, but after trade, when commodity price ratios are equalized, factor price ratios will also be equalized. So the factor price equalization theorem will be holding true. Now, what about the Hexarolline theorem? Is it also true? Now, the Hexarolline theorem is also correct only when the price definition is adopted. On the basis of physical definition, no trade can be predicted because both the countries will be having the same labor capital endowment ratio. So it is not possible to identify any pattern of trade. But just as we considered earlier, suppose for the second country, country B, wage rental ratio is higher, and for the country A, no, suppose this is lower, and for country A, suppose this is the wage rental ratio. Then Px by Py will be higher for country A. So Px by Py will be higher for country A. W by R in country A is higher than W by R in country B. So country A is relatively more capital abundant because W by R is higher. So Px by Py is also higher in country A. Now as Px by Py is higher in country A, then as trade opens up, then country A will export Y and it will import X. So the Hexarolline theorem is true only if the price definition is adopted. Now we may consider some other cases also. So in fact we shall be talking about two more cases. One is case 2 and the other is some other alternative case. So let us now consider case 2. So here country B's overall labor capital ratio lies somewhere in the region MK, where country A's overall labor capital ratio is OM. So let's consider the diagram once again. So OK, right. So OK is the labor capital ratio for country A, right? And MK, this is the range. So we are assuming that country B's overall labor capital ratio will lie somewhere in the region MK. So it is like somewhere here. So if we consider this assumption, then country A is relatively more labor abundant than country B. Okay. Now, so that is on the basis of the physical definition. So let us now see what about the factor price ratio range for country A. So just follow the red line RS. So RS is the factor price zone. Similarly, P1, P2 is the factor price zone. Now consider country B. So let's assume that its endowment is given by E, which is lying in between M and K. Now that is an assumption. You can consider some other range also. But here there is one reason for taking this point M, because if we consider this point R, which is the maximum factor price ratio for country A, so corresponding to that we have obtained the point M here. So that is once again an assumption. We can always relax and we can consider some other factor price, some other labor capital ratio. Okay, so let us come back once again to the country B's overall labor capital ratio. So it is OE. So just read from this blue line. So the factor price range will be given by QT. So this is QT, factor price zone. The commodity price zone, you just read from here. So it will be given by P3, P4. Now here the relevant regions do not coincide, but they overlap. Now in that case also there will be complete factor price equalization. Why? So this green zone is the zone of overlapping. So if the pre-trade factor prices are somewhere here, suppose this is for A and this is for B, then the pre-trade commodity prices will be lying somewhere in this overlapping zone. So if there is free trade, then this commodity prices will be equalized and accordingly the factor price will also be equalized. So there will be a tendency for the factor price equalization theorem to be possible. In this context also, the Hexarolline theorem may also be true, both on the basis of the factor abundance definition and the price definition. So, the labor abundant country is country A and B is relatively more capital abundant. So, we can very well show that Px by Py in country A may be less than Px by Py in country B. So that Px by Py in country A is somewhere here and Px by Py for country B is this is Px by Py for country A and this is Px by Py for country B. So that is the initial pre-trade situation. So this is for A. This is for A. Sorry, this is for B and this is for A. So we get that Px by Py Px by Py in A is less than Px by Py B. So the labor abundant country will be having a comparative advantage in the labor intensive commodity. So as trade opens up, then it will be exporting X. So prices will be equalized and accordingly factor prices will be equalized. So as long as the two pre-trade commodity prices lies in this zone, then the factor price equalization will be complete. Now we consider some other cases also. Now suppose the prices, the post-trade equilibrium prices do not lie in the overlapping zone or in the shaded zone. So it may lie somewhere in this region P2, P4, in this region P2, P4, or it may lie somewhere in this region P1, P3. Now that is also a possibility. So if it lies in the overlapping zone, then factor price equalization theorem will be possible. But there is no guarantee that it will always be lying in this overlapping zone. So the post-trade equilibrium price may very well lie in the zone P2, P4 or it may lie in the zone P1, P3. Now what happens if the post-trade commodity price ratio lies in the zone P4, P2? Now this P4, P2, this zone is actually lying in the P3, P4 zone. So here this is the zone for country A. Therefore, in this zone, country A will be producing no. P2, P4 is the zone which is lying within the zone specified for country B because its zone is given by P3, P4, whereas country A's permissible zone is P1, P2. So that is why if the post-trade price lies here in this P4, P2 zone, then country B will be producing both the commodities because it is lying in its permissible zone, whereas country A will be producing only X because it will be producing here it will be producing here, so it will be producing only X. So in this case, there is no incomplete specialization in the free trade situation. So factor price equalization theorem will not be possible. Now consider the second case where the post-trade equilibrium price lies in the other range, that is in the P1, P3 range. So it is lying here, P1, P3 range. Now A's permissible range is P1, P2, whereas B's permissible range is P3, P4. So if we are talking about this P3, P1 range, then A will be producing both the commodities because it is post-trade equilibrium commodity price is lying in its own permissible zone. But what about country B? This price, suppose it is here, this price is lying beyond its permissible zone. So then it will be producing only Y, as it is clear. So it is stopping here, so it will be producing only Y. So there will be incomplete specialization in country A but complete specialization in country B. So therefore FPA will not be possible because the assumption of incomplete specialization under free trade is violated. Now, if we have a limited migration, then the situation might be improved. So, from here we get a very important result, that is, if there is some overlapping zone of factor prices as well as the commodity prices, then there is a tendency for the post-trade commodity price ratio to lie in that overlapping zone. So if that happens, then factor price equalization will be possible and it will be complete. But if the post-trade commodity price ratio does not lie in this overlapping zone, then the factor price equalization theorem may not be valid. So factor price equalization may not be possible. So migration will be improving the situation, but here we have not assumed migration. Now, of course, the trade will be making the two factor price ratios closer, but complete inequality will not be attained. Now, what about the Hexarolline theorem? Now, here, uh, so far as our assumption goes, A must export X and B must export Y because A is relatively more labor abundant and B is relatively more capital abundant. Now, this will be true if and only if pre-trade price in A is lower than that in B, but that may not be necessarily true. So once again, Hexarolline theorem will depend on where the uh, pre-trade commodity prices for the two countries are lying. Now we consider a case when factor price equalization is not possible even if we have no factor intensity reversal. So we have already told that the assumption of factor intensity reversal is very important. But now we shall show that even in the presence of factor price equalization will not be possible if the factor endowments in the two countries are much different. Now we assume that the factor endowment of country A is given by OK. So this is the factor endowment of country A, and country B's factor endowment is OZ. So now the factor endowment of country B is not lying within this zone MK as it was in the case that we considered earlier. So now we shall see what would be the problem if the factor endowment of country B does not lie within this zone. So once again, by our assumption, country A is labor abundant. So what will be the factor price zone for country A? So it is RS, and the commodity price zone is once again P1, P2. Now what about country B? So its endowment is OZ. So now the relevant regions do not overlap. So QT is the factor price zone for country B, and RS is the factor price zone for country A. Similarly, P1, P2 is for A and P3, P4 is for B. So therefore, the pre-trade factor price ratio and the commodity price ratio in B will be lying somewhere here in this P3, P4 range, and for the country A, it will be lying somewhere in this P1, P2 range. So therefore, the commodity price ratio in Px by Py in A is less than Px by Pyb. Therefore, A must export Y. So A must export X and B must export Y. So therefore, the Hexarolline theorem is true in this context. But what about the factor price equalization theorem? Now the post-trade price lies in the range of P3, P2. So this is clear because P1, P2 is the zone for country A and P3, P4 is the zone for country B. So therefore, the post-trade price ratio will be lying in between P3, P2. So it will not be here because, or rather it will not be here also, because we have B's price to be here and A's price to be here. So A's price will increase and B's price will fall. So it will be lying in between P2, P3. But there are three zones here: P3, P4, P1, P4 and P1, P2. So these are the three zones. If the commodity price ratio lies in P3, P4, then B will be producing both, but A will be producing only X, right? Because it is, then if it is lies in P3, P4, then the wage rental ratio is more than OR, so that it will not be producing Y, it will be producing only X. So if it is lying in between P1 and P2, then A will be producing both because it is lying in its permissible zone. But then B will be producing only Y because its zone ends here. So it will be producing only Y. So here you do not have incomplete specialization in both. And here also you do not have incomplete specialization in both. If it lies in this zone P1, P4, then what happens? Then B will be producing only Y. Clearly, consider P4, B is producing Y, and consider P1, A is producing only X. So in all such cases, there is complete specialization at least by one of the two countries. So therefore, complete factor price equalization will not be possible in this case. So the post-trade factor price ratio in B will be lying somewhere here, and the post-trade factor price ratio in country A will be lying somewhere here. So still, even after free trade, the factor price ratio in country B will be higher than the factor price ratio in country A, but of course the pre-trade gap will be reducing to some extent. For example, If earlier the wage rental ratio was here, so now it will fall down to here, and if the wage rental ratio was here, so now that will increase to here, so that there is a tendency towards factor price equalization. But of course, as it is mentioned, there will be no complete factor price equalization. Now we consider the case of the factor intensity reversal. So what is meant by factor intensity reversal? Then in presence of factor intensity reversal, commodities cannot be ranked unequivocally in terms of its factor intensities. So commodity X would be labor intensive for some wage rental ratio, and it will be capital intensive for some other wage rental ratio. So let us now assume that X is labor intensive for wage rental ratio to be less than W. So W is the critical wage rental ratio. So the actual wage rental ratio, if it is less than W, then X is labor intensive, and if the actual wage rental ratio is greater than W, then it is capital intensive. And if W by R is exactly equal to W, the critical wage rental ratio, then both the commodities are equally labor intensive. If we now go back to our earlier result, then we found that Px by Py and W by R is positively related if X is relatively more labor intensive. So if X is relatively more capital intensive, then this relationship will be less than 0. So this relationship will be less than 0. So therefore, there will be a negative relationship between Px by Py and W by R. So we are using that understanding here. So what we have pointed out here is that this W is the critical wage rental ratio. So if the wage rental ratio is less than that, actual wage rental ratio is less than that, then X is relatively more labor intensive, so that we get the increasing relationship between Px by Py and W by R. Now, as wage rental ratio increases beyond the critical wage rental ratio W, then the relationship between Px by Py and W by R will change, so that now this curve will be backward bending. And if the wage rental ratio is exactly equal to W, then we get the kink point S. So this curve is upward rising first when X is relatively more labor intensive, and then it is backward bending when X is relatively more capital intensive. And at this point of kink, the two commodities will be of equal labor intensities. So price ratio is an increasing function of W by R when W by R is less than W, or when X is labor intensive, and price ratio is a decreasing function of W by R for W by R greater than W. Now let us see what happens to the factor price equalization. So we assume that in country A, the labor capital ratio is okay. Now if the endowment is okay, labor by capital ratio is okay, then the commodities cannot be ranked in terms of the factor intensity. So they are equal in terms of the factor intensities. But the problem with the factor intensity reversal is that the one-to-one correspondence between the commodity price ratio and the factor price ratio is lost. For any given W by R, we can get a single commodity price ratio. For example, if W by R is here, so you can have the single commodity price ratio. But for the same, the reverse is not true. So if you consider a single commodity price ratio here, then you can get two wage rental ratios. So the one-to-one correspondence is lost. So what's the implication of this? The implication is, even with incomplete specialization, the factor price equalization may not be possible. So additional information regarding factor proportion is necessary. So now we shall be showing that even with incomplete specialization, there will be no tendency towards factor price equalization. So this is the first case that we shall be talking about. So the factor endowment ratios are either larger or smaller than OK. Now we have already shown that OK is very crucial labor capital ratio, because if the endowment ratio is OK, then the commodities cannot be ranked unequivocally in terms of factor intensities. Now, so suppose both the factor endowment ratios are either greater than OK. So suppose one's endowment is here and another's endowment is here. So even if there is factor intensity reversal, this is not experienced by the two countries. So whatever be the actual case, they are lying in this region. So for them, X is relatively more capital intensive. So that Hexarolline theorem will be true on the basis of the price definition, and then the factor price equalization is possible if the zones of factor prices and the commodity prices overlap. Similarly, if both the countries have some factor endowment which is less than OK, then although there is factor intensity reversal, that is not experienced by the two countries. So for them, Y is always more labor intensive than X. So once again, you can find out the different zones of factor price and zones of commodity price. And if there is any overlapping zone, then once again factor price equalization will be possible. So here we get one very important result, that even if you have factor intensity reversal, then that does not necessarily mean that factor price equalization will not be possible. So it is possible in this case. Now this is the second case, where A's endowment is OK and B's endowment is OK. So pre-trade factor prices are simply equal and there is no trade. So here there is no question of Hexarolline theorem to hold, no question of factor price equalization theorem to hold. But of course, this is a bit unrealistic case. So we shall not be considering this case much seriously. Rather, now we shall be talking about a case where factor intensity reversal will indeed have its effect on factor price equalization theorem. Case 3 is another case where complete factor price equalization is not possible, but there is a tendency. So, see here, A's endowment is OK and B's endowment is OL. So, which is greater than OK. So now B is relatively more labor intensive. Now, so A's factor price ratio is only W because its endowment is OK. But B's range is YZ. So this is B's range, YZ. Now before trade, Px by Py in country B is lower than that in A, obviously, because A's commodity price ratio is this A, OA, whereas B's commodity price ratio will be lying in this zone CE. So therefore, Px by Py is lower in B than in A. So A will be specializing in Y, B will be specializing either in X, or it will be producing both. Now this is because uh, A's endowment is only OK, so it is here, and Px by Py in country A is higher. So that is why A will be specializing in Y. But the free trade price ratio will be lying in the zone AE. So as it was discussed earlier, so it can lie either in the AC region or it can lie in the CE region. Now, if it is lying in the AC region, then B will be specializing only in X, because here the prices will be beyond its permissible range. So, as it is seen from here, it will be producing only X. But if the commodity price ratio is lying in this shaded region, then what happens? It will be producing both the commodities. So complete factor price equalization is not possible, but there is a tendency, because its price ratio, B's price ratio, will be moving in this direction, although A's price ratio will be lying somewhere here. So there will be a tendency towards the factor price equalization. But Hexarolline theorem will be true from the point of view of B only, but it is not applicable for A. So it has two commodities with equal intensities. Now this is actually the fourth case where once again complete factor price equalization is not possible, but there is a tendency. So once again A's endowment is OK, but B's endowment is OJ, which is less than OK. So now B is capital abundant, but X is capital intensive. And for country A, its endowment is OK, so it is relatively more labor abundant, but both the commodities will be of equal factor intensities. So A's factor price ratio is only W, whereas B's zone will be given by TR. So before trade, Px by Py is lower than B than in A, because B's Px by Py will be lying in this zone, whereas A's relative commodity price will be given by OA. So therefore, Px by Py is lower in B. Now, after the trade, price will be lying in the zone AD. So A will be specializing in Y for obvious reason, because before trade Px by Py in A was higher, so A will be specializing in Y, but B will be specializing either in X if the price falls in the AB zone. So once again this is beyond the permissible zone, so it will be producing only X. Or if the price lies in between this region, that is BD here, then it is in its permissible zone, so it will be producing both the commodities. So once again in this case complete factor price equalization is not possible, but there is a tendency. Why? Because before trade this was the commodity price for A, and after trade before trade, the commodity price for B was lying in this region. So after trade, there was a tendency towards commodity price equalization, but here we cannot have the factor price equalization completely, because one of the important assumption is not valid here, but there is a tendency for factor price equalization, so it will be moving in the downward direction to reach this point. So complete FP is not possible, but there is a tendency. Hexarolline theorem is true for B once again, but it is not applicable for A, as the two commodities have equal intensities. Now we come to the case of factor intensity reversal proper. So A's endowment is OM, which is less than OK, and B's endowment is ON, which is greater than OK. So now B is relatively more labor abundant. So commodity price for country A is given by AB, and the commodity price zone for country B is given by CD. So the corresponding factor price zones are RS for A and UV for B. So in this case, there will be no complete factor price equalization, and there may not be any tendency towards factor price equalization. X is capital intensive in A and labor intensive in B. So if A exports Y and B exports X, W by R will rise as both the nations will be exporting the labor intensive commodity. So the factor prices will be moving in the same direction. So the initial disparity may expand or contract depending on which factor ratio changes faster. Now it is clear that A is capital abundant relative to B both in terms of price and physical definition. But A exports Y, which is labor intensive in A, and B exports X, which is labor intensive in B. So Hexarolline theorem is once again not true from the point of view of both the countries. So now we have shown the case where factor intensity reversal is having its impact, its real impact on the factor price equalization theorem. So from this we get a very important result which states that factor intensity reversal may not be very crucial for factor price equalization theorem to break down. So you can have no factor price equalization even in the absence of factor intensity reversal, whereas even in the presence of factor intensity reversal, the factor price equalization theorem may also hold. So that is how we can show the factor price equalization theorem in its relative sense. Now we move on to the absolute factor price equalization, which is actually a bit easier. So under incomplete specialization, both the countries will be producing both the commodities. So the price equations may be written like 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now with trade, the commodity prices will be equalized across the nations. So now you will be having only two equations, because PAX will be equal to PBX and PAY will be equal to PBY. So here we are talking in terms of the absolute prices. So if the prices are equalized, then we have 2 equations to solve for 4 unknowns. So hence we must have WA is equal to WB and RA is equal to RB. So this says that if absolute prices are equalized through trade, then the absolute factor prices will also be equalized through trade. So trade acts not only um, as some factor which will be equalizing the commodity prices, but it will be acting as a proxy for the international mobility of factors of production.